Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Greater Sage Grouse Compensatory Mitigation Oversight Group meeting. It's the first one we've ever held, so congratulations, we're all here. The Compensatory Mitigation Oversight Group, we affectionately call the CMOG, so you may hear that term throughout the meeting today. The CMOG was established as part of the Wyoming Greater Sage Grouse Compensatory Mitigation Act, which is under Wyoming Statutes 9-19-201 et sec. It's also part of the Board of Land Commissioners, Chapter 29, Rules and Regulations. Just to give everybody a little bit of background, the CMOG is comprised of representatives from the Department of Agriculture, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust Account Board, and Office of State Lands and Investments. OSLI, or the Office of State Lands and Investments, is the chair of the CMOG. So I am Jen Scoggin. I'm the director for OSLI and will be chairing the meeting today. Other representatives are more of in a consultant type role to review the credit provider applications and other proposed mitigation measures. Those representatives include U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and any other state, local, or federal agencies as requested by the CMOG for input. The role of the CMOG, we evaluate and provide technical review of the conservation bank applications using criteria under Chapter 29, largely Section 7 of the Board of Land Commissioners rules. Then we recommend certification of any mitigation credit provider seeking approval when appropriate. We submit that recommendation to the Board of Land Commissioners for its approval at a public meeting when the CMOG determines that the credit provider meets the requirements of the statutes and the rules. Today, we are here to consider the Dempsey Ridge Conservation Bank application. I don't know, do we have any of the federal folks on the line too? Okay. Okay, great. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we first start with the CMOG folks? Why don't we go around at the horn here and introduce ourselves, and then any of the other CMOG representation consultants, whatever that might be on the line, if they want to introduce themselves, that would be great. As I mentioned, I'm Jen Scoggin. I'm the director of the Office of State Lands and Investments.
Bob Budd, director of the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust.
Amanda Losh, I am the supervisor of the Habitat Protection Program with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department.
I'm Chris Wickman. I'm the manager of the Natural Resources and Policy Division with the Wyoming Department of Ag.
And I'm Doug Miyamoto, also with the Department of Ag. I'm the director there.
All right, who have we got on the Zoom, if you will, as the panelists?
Hi, Heather McFerrin. I'm the Wyoming Sagebrush Ecosystem Coordinator with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Apologies that we can't be there in person.
Hi, Jenny Marsliff, the Sage Grouse Implementation Coordinator and Mitigation Specialist for the BLM.
Anyone else? Brian.
Sorry, this is Brian Jensen. I'm the state biologist for Wyoming NRCS. Sorry, I'm having problems with my phone.
That's okay. All right, thank you all, and thank you all for your participation. How I thought we would run the meeting today is, now that we've sort of introduced ourselves, we'll turn it over to the Dempsey Ridge folks for they're going to provide a presentation for the CMOG, and then after that, we'll open it up for questions amongst the CMOG members and the other representatives who are assisting with evaluation of the applications. And then after that, we'll go to next steps. We'll see if there's a desire for further information or if we're ready to make a recommendation, and we'll kind of go from there. We have an hour and a half set aside for today. So hopefully that's enough time. But with that, I'll turn it over to the Dempsey Ridge folks. And if you'd please introduce your team.
Good morning. My name is Nathan Ayers with Sierra Ridge Consulting, and we have led this project for the last several years on behalf of the Dempsey Ridge Conservation Bank.
Good morning. My name is Mary Ann Shaner. I'm an attorney at Hathaway & Coons here in Cheyenne, and I'm part of the team. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm John Kmeyer with SWCA Environmental Consultants, providing biological support for the team.
My name is Charles Klinger. I'm an attorney with Luthien Boyles in Thane, Wyoming, and acting as outside counsel helping the Sierra Ridge team with this application.
Great, thank you all. And before you get started, I'll just caution everybody in the room here today, these mics are pretty sensitive. So if you're not speaking, you might want to make sure that your mic is turned off. Otherwise, the cameras will seek you out and you'll be on the camera. So anyway, with that, please proceed. Thank you.
Would it be all right at this time to set up the screen share to follow through the presentation?
Certainly.
Madam Chair, we do also have a participant via Zoom, Mike McCollum. So I'm not sure if he's able to introduce himself as well.
Okay. Ben, is he a panelist or?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. I was talking and nobody was responding. So, yeah, this is Mike McCullum. I'm a consultant for the Dempsey Ridge Bank, and I've been helping them pull together all the bank documents and going forward. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Glad to be here.
Terrific. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to everyone for taking the time and setting this up and the support to get here. We appreciate this opportunity. We have prepared a fairly brief, high-level presentation to introduce the project to those who are generally unfamiliar with the Dempsey Ridge Conservation Bank, with the expectations that we'll spend a great deal of time going through the various documents in depth and having some discussions throughout the process. Listed here are a few of the key components I will touch on. And certainly these and others that we'll open up to the group for discussion at the conclusion of this presentation. In order here, I have overall bank objectives, assurances, long-term management plans, service area, biological studies, assessments, and methodologies that have been performed. And at the conclusion of that, we'll turn the time over to the group and lead out discussions for the rest of our time. So Dempsey Ridge Conservation Bank is located on the Circle B Ranches, which is situated between Cokeville and Kimmerer in Lincoln County. The bank consists of approximately 17,000 deeded acres, and the ranch itself is close to 60,000 acres with the leases included. Consistent with the Wyoming statutes and the Chapter 29 sage grouse mitigation rules, the bank has been developed over several years to provide off-site compensatory mitigation for greater sage grouse and sage grouse obligate species. The bank contains a list of real estate assurances such as perpetual restrictive covenants found in Exhibit D. Those restrictive covenants have expressly defined purposes, objectives, uses, and restrictions, and they provide for the state of Wyoming as a beneficiary. The bank also includes a very large perpetual endowment fund described in Exhibit C2. Overall, this fund will have approximately $4 million corpus with distributions directed towards the ongoing management, monitoring, and maintenance of the bank property in perpetuity. In the CPEI, we have assurances and a secondary fund created solely for the protection against catastrophic events. Again, with Osley as a direct beneficiary and of course the state of Wyoming as the intended third-party beneficiary. And the intent behind the secondary fund is to protect not only the state, but the overall objectives of preservation through the creation of the bank. We also address in our documents in great detail the designated transmission corridor. Those are found in the CPEI and in Exhibits E1. In those documents, we describe provisions in the event of future impacts within the corridor, as well as methodologies used to reduce and withdraw habitat from the bank's credit calculations for current existing and future impacts. Our long-term management plan is outlined in detail, and it covers actions, action items, triggers, monitoring requirements, and describes extensively throughout Exhibit C4 and the CPEI as well. And lastly, before I turn some time over to John Kmeyer to introduce the biological overview, we have listed in the banking documents our geographic service area, and that's described in Exhibit B2. Within that description and narrative, we have identified the WAFO management zones that are located within the state of Wyoming's boundary as a service area for the bank. So with that, I would be happy to turn a few minutes over to John, and I've got the slide following. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. The biological approach for this project has been very robust. We started coordination with, it was the group prior to this group. It was originally the IRT, and I believe, I don't remember what the prior group was called, if it had a name. But early involvement with all of you, your agencies, to understand what your concerns were, what your interests were in terms of the data that we needed to provide to demonstrate the quality and sustainability of the habitat that's out there. As a result of this coordination, we developed habitat assessment methodologies and credit evaluation procedures in close coordination with the biologists and the species experts here in the state of Wyoming, and collected data in following those habitat assessment methods to evaluate habitat in all 4 seasons. That included vegetation conditions, occupancy of the bank by actual sage grouse, which is very important, obviously, as well as an assessment of potential threats that are on the landscape, the transmission line system, existing agricultural activities, weeds, fire management, or fire risk, to identify appropriate management and protective measures to ensure that the habitat is available in perpetuity in the bank. As part of this, we have had ongoing regular communication with Game and Fish, other members of the CMOG, and other stakeholders over the 5 years of data collection and then analysis and reporting. So next slide, Nathan. As part of the suitability determination, we followed, again, the recommendation of the agencies. We collected data at 263 vegetation sampling and habitat assessment points. That equates to about 1 per 60 acres of suitable habitat in the bank. So a large number of habitat assessment and habitat suitability locations across the properties. We characterize seasonal habitat suitability and classified ecological sites for purposes of developing management actions and management procedures that would be used to ensure that the habitat is maintained at a high level in the future. As I mentioned earlier, we accounted for all anthropogenic disturbances, both present and reasonably foreseeable. In the case of the transmission line corridor, there is a reasonably foreseeable transmission line that could be constructed in that corridor in the next few years. We did account for that, the presence of that, and worked with Matt Fry and Nicholas to understand the impacts in the DDCT process. As a result of this, we calculated credits based on the acres of suitable habitat as we identified them in the field, as modified by those anthropogenic impacts, both agriculture, transmission lines, and any other disturbances that were on the landscape. Slide, Nathan. As a result of this work, we've developed an informed management plan. The management plan, as I mentioned, is developed using ecological site, state, and transition model concepts. That process allows us to identify the current condition of an acre of habitat and identify appropriate management actions to move it to a more appropriate or more suitable habitat state in the future. The management actions primarily that would be relied upon by the bank are livestock grazing. It is an active cattle ranch currently, and it is contemplated that that would continue. And then also robust fire management, weed management, and other adaptive management risk assessment procedures to identify other measures that may need to be taken in the future. This also includes a robust monitoring program to ensure that the actions that are being taken are successful. That would include vegetation monitoring and let counts on a regular basis to ensure that the habitat is responding to the management actions that we're applying, and then working with all of you through an adaptive management process to identify additional techniques as they become available in the future to maintain and improve any habitat conditions that are out there.
Thank you, John. So to conclude the presentation, we have strived over a number of years to develop and meet an absolute gold standard in conservation banking, and with the hopes to bring this incredible piece of land into a component in a piece of conservation success for the state of Wyoming. We've worked over the years diligently to do and follow the guidance, to meet the statutes and to exceed the requirements to the best of our abilities, and to keep up with the science and the information available to us. And we've strived to present a project that would, serve for generations to come on this front. So with that, I have a quick reference guide that I've included that we can present the exhibits and where they're found within the documents, as well as we have comment letter, the most recent comment letter from the Game and Fish with some of our comments to address that we can also follow through. And so with that, we would turn the time back over to the panel and open up the remainder of the meeting for questions and discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. As a preliminary matter, are there any questions about the presentation that Dempsey Ridge just provided? Okay, hearing none, then I guess we'll just dive right into it. Who wants to start? Should we start on the CMOG here? Game and Fish, do you have lingering questions and concerns? I think I do recall reviewing a letter that was recently provided dated September 13th, and I think there were some questions in there, but I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Lynch.
Sure, thank you. So we do appreciate all of the coordination and collaboration that has happened over the years, and I will caveat my participation on this project with the note that I haven't been involved with it from the very beginning. So I did kind of pick up on it this spring and played a little bit of catch up with reading the documents. And then most recently with the more finalized complete package that Jason sent out last week. So I don't have I guess that's needless to say, I don't have all the history on the project completely. So forgive me if there's something that I'm missing that came up in my comments. But I'd be happy to step through the biological areas for credit requirements and some of the outstanding things that may warrant some additional discussion, if that would be a helpful place to start. Okay. As far as evidence of use being a mandatory category for the establishment of a credit bank, I think I bulleted out what I saw in the proposal relative to evidence of use. I think that documents the bank is used by sage grouse. One question I would have for you is whether or not you have additional data that demonstrates use across the bank aside from location of lek and just the general mapping of habitat that indicates it's suitable habitat that would be used. So I'd be interested to know what other data is available.
See if I can get this right. Madam Chairwoman. Did I do all right? All right, I'm good. I believe there was actually an omission of information in attachment A to exhibit C4. Pages 50 to 55 of that document actually do demonstrate use other than what was in what you saw in the proposal. We looked at both the wildlife observation system data that were provided by Game and Fish, but then we also compiled a list of incidental observations that were made over the years of survey. We do have incidental observations, including individual birds, fresh and old pellets, feathers, tracks in snow during winter months, and then unviable eggs of sage grouse that appear to have been depredated by either probably ravens or magpies, but some sort of corvid. We do have those in all 4 phases and all properties of the bank, and we can provide that additional information. I'm not exactly sure how that was omitted from the attachment A. I also have a printout of those pages if it would be helpful for you to see that now. So.
And Madam Chair and Ms. Losh, I can reference some of the documents on the screen to screen share of observations throughout the various study periods and what those observations and incidental observations consisted of, as well as photos and location points that were taken throughout the project site to document the use throughout all the phases and throughout all the seasons. And so what I've done, as we've sent documents and they've been evolving, and I guess this is more of a global comment to the banking documents in general, they've evolved and we've received comment and we've found some inconsistencies either on acreages or omissions of maps that have been inadvertently left out of new versions that were in existing versions. Some of that was intentional through some guidance or interaction. So I have an appendix, which I didn't modify any of the documents that have been sent out so we can work with the same versions of documents, but I have an appendix that we can reference on our end as well to show maps and tables that we can incorporate back into our management plan or other documents as needed.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think that there is enough information in the documents that I read to demonstrate there is evidence of use across the bank, but I think that extra data would really drive the point home. Moving on to the disturbance category, the mandatory portion of it. You all worked with us closely over the summer to revise the modified DDCT from the 2018 version that was run because the bank boundaries had changed a little bit over the years. And then certainly our statewide disturbance layer has been updated over the years as well. So we wanted to make sure we had the accurate number for the actual bank boundary and what we're accounting for on the ground in terms of existing disturbance. And so we reran those numbers over the summer with the disturbance coming out at 5.08, which was within the 0 to 10% threshold that's required in the credit requirements, and also a density of 0.11 per 640 acres, which is also within the requirements. One of the things that I noted upon taking a second closer look at the modified DDCT last week was the way we were accounting for the 3 existing transmission lines that run through the bank. We were accounting for the footprint of the lines themselves and not the right of way. And per the governor's executive order, when accounting for power lines of any size, distribution to transmission, we use the right of way length times width as the disturbance footprint. And so in light of that, that disturbance needed to be added to the statewide disturbance layer and the results rerun again, which I worked with Nicholas on earlier this week. So we do have revised results for the modified DDCT that do bump the disturbance up a little bit from 5.08 to 5.87% if we're accounting for those 3 transmission line right-of-ways consistent with the EO. And so then that also translates to an increase in the disturbance acres, existing disturbance acres that are on the bank as a whole, from 867 acres to 1,001 acres when accounting for those right-of-ways. So along with that mandatory, or with the disturbance category and a potential credit adjustment per the credit requirements, one of our recommendations was that this group, the CMOG, consider whether or not that 10% credit discount was warranted, because the disturbance percent is within the 0 to 10, but it's over the 5%. And so the rules do call for evaluation of whether or not a discount is warranted.
So, Madam Chair and Ms. Losh, so to understand the most current DDCT that accounts for the 250-foot right-of-way of the existing lines, does that include a proposed alternate route that is on the lower end of the bank properties within Fish Creek?
Yes, so The added disturbance accounts for the right-of-ways associated with the existing lines. And there's 3 existing lines that run through, I believe, phase 2 and 4 of the bank. And there's 1 existing line that runs through phase 1. So there's 250-foot rights-of-ways associated with those lines that are accounted for. But as far as the future potential Gateway West line that will run through that corridor, there is currently no accounting for that line. So the alternate route that you were talking about that bumps out south to the southwest-ish of phase 1 is not being counted as disturbance in the analysis.
Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman, I'm happy to keep going, or if the CMOG would want to discuss the 10% credit discount at this time, I'm not sure what is the preference. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
Okay. Moving on to habitat suitability as a mandatory category. You all have done a phenomenal amount of habitat assessment out there, as John described, using habitat assessment framework methodologies, and also some rapid habitat assessments with the department has also been using those in more recent years as well. So thank you for all that diligent and, as you described it, robust habitat work on the bank. I think one of the two things under this mandatory category dealing with the habitat assessment themselves is going back to ensuring that the number of acres that we're calling suitable accounts for by subtracting all of the unsuitable and disturbed acres. And so I think you've got a majority of those, but perhaps not all, because the statewide disturbance layer, I don't believe has fully been accounted for in that calculation, especially in light of adding those 250-foot rights-of-ways for the transmission lines. So I think maybe there's a little bit of math correction to go in hand there with those approximately 15,000 acres that were identified as suitable habitat. And then the other question that I would have is just a little bit more discussion, or if there's more data or information or mapping associated with cheatgrass prevalence across the bank.
Madam Chair, Ms. Loesch, I'll answer your first question first regarding the disturbance. If we could get the final layer from the DDCT to take a look at, that would be really helpful so that we can understand where those differences do occur. I do think that there are some areas that we considered as suitable around the agricultural fields that maybe the state system considers disturbed. And that could be creating some of the discrepancies as well. And there's also, I mean, if we go back and are correcting for disturbances, there are a few areas of disturbance in the state's layers that we feel have met reclamation standards. There's a historic well pad, I believe in I forget it, it's in phase 4, I believe, along the Hams Fork that we believe has met reclamation standards. We can provide documentation on that to hopefully remove that from the DDCT calculations and the account of disturbance on the project site. So, but yeah, happy to work with you to understand and resolve that issue and make sure that we're all on the same page. Regarding cheatgrass, I actually, the last few days in response to your letter, evaluated that in more detail. I do have a brief write-up that we can provide to you after the fact. You have it up. So in all, in the 263 vegetation assessment points that we looked at, we only found cheatgrass on 11 of those 263, so only 4% of the sites. And in the number of recordings, so line point intercept primarily being those, I think that accounted for 24,320 individual data points with the line point intercept data. We only found 13 points of those 24,000 that contain cheatgrass in either the top canopy or lower canopy or basal cover. So very, very low cover across the site. Of those 11 sites, 7 of them were in phase 4 on the Hufford property, primarily associated with previous agricultural disturbance, which I think is to be expected. That's where I would anticipate them to be. There's also a small fire on the adjacent BLM that came into a portion of phase 4 years ago. One of the transects that we have there had about 3% cheatgrass cover. It was the highest cover percent, I believe, that we had on the entire property. The other transects in that burn area showed very little or no cheatgrass, showing a fairly resilient native ecosystem that's seeming to keep the cheatgrass at bay. That is one thing that we have talked about, though, as one of the initial management actions, is really taking care of some of those cheatgrass infestations. While they're small, we don't want them to spread. So on phase 4, making sure that we are using the appropriate herbicides and the appropriate approach to take care of those and make sure that they don't become a problem. But overall, I think cheatgrass is a very minor component of the vegetation community. I think for the most part, it has very low probability of spreading, especially outside of the Hufford property on phase 4. Just very, very low occurrence other than in that one phase and one property in phase 4.
Mr. Wickman, you had a question?
Madam Chair, so what methods are you using for determining presence of cheatgrass? Are you doing line intercept down as we go through?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Mr. Wickman, we've used a combination of ocular estimates, line point intercept, and then we also have some Daubenmeier frames that we've done to determine cheatgrass cover percent. Obviously, knowing that line point intercept doesn't do a great job of capturing cover percentage of cheatgrass. We do have a combination of all of those things. And I did evaluate all the data sets that we had to look at percent cover. It is something obviously that we know is out there. It's part of our management process and plan, and something that would be taken care of inside the bank.
Thank you for that additional information. And you said you had developed a specific write-up for more information on cheatgrass. So did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we do have, it's a 3-page write-up, just a brief write-up of the overall percent cover across the bank, and then a phase-by-phase assessment of how many transects and how many locations we actually identified, as well as the ecological sites associated with those infestations, so that we can identify, is it associated with individual transects. It does seem to be primarily in that lower precipitation zone near Cokeville, which is to be expected. But it doesn't seem to be associated with any single individual ecological site. We have in coarse upland and sandy and loamy, all 3 of those. So I do think that it should be a useful write-up for you to take a look at. We can incorporate that into any of the future bank documents if desired.
Thank you. Okay, then moving on to still under habitat suitability as a mandatory category, but under the piece that talks about suitability is greater than 5% sagebrush cover. Just a couple notes under there regarding a few of the ecological sites. So you had mentioned that you broke the bank down into 9 ecological sites, 8 of them containing suitable habitat for sage grouse. Just a couple of comments. And when reading through that more detailed information in the documents of the bank proposal, 2 of the sites you identified, the sandy 10 to 14 and the overflow 15 to 19, having areas within those ecological sites that have less than 5% cover. And just curious about the extent of those areas, if they're little patches or big swaths. So I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit. And then also the other ecological site, sub-irrigated 10 to 14, which by the description in the report does not contain sagebrush cover at all. And therefore suitability associated with it would be dependent on proximity to sagebrush cover and or documented use, if that's available, if you might speak to both of those.
Sure, Madam Chair, Ms. Loesch. I did look in detail at that as well. The sandy 10 to 14 site that didn't have, I think there was one transect that did not have sagebrush on it out of dozens of sites, I think, in that ecological site. It did have rabbit brush. So it was in part of that burned area. So there was a portion of that area that where the sagebrush had not yet recovered or it wasn't detected in our line point intercept transects. That ecological site in general, though, if you look at the summary statistics in the management plan documents, does have, and I can pull up the exact amount, but it has 18 to 26, I think it was one of those two numbers, average sagebrush cover. And I can pull that up if we do need the exact number. But as a whole, that ecological site has substantial and suitable sagebrush cover in it. It was just that single transect that was very low. The other two ecological sites that did not have sagebrush, I say sagebrush, I should say big sagebrush or low sagebrush in them, are the wet fresh meadow and sub-irrigated. Wet fresh meadow, I wouldn't expect anything other than silver sage there. I don't think that any of our transects showed silver sagebrush. But it did, those are generally fairly narrow bands of habitat that provide suitable and high quality brood habitat, summer use habitat. And so I do think that they provide, even though they don't have sagebrush as a component of their vegetation community, they still provide a very important value for sage grouse populations on the bank. The sub-irrigated ecological site also had a substantial amount of shrub cover. I believe it was, in all three sites, I believe it was like 18 to 32% shrub cover, primarily silver sage and shrubby cinquefoil. So those two species obviously are not big sagebrush, but we do have observations of use within that sub-irrigated site. We have one male that was flushed during, and it's actually on the maps that Nathan talked about and I can point it out. We have one male that was flushed during surveys of a sub-irrigated transect, and then 4 unknown grouse that were flushed during subsequent surveys. So we do have demonstrated use in that ecological site, as well as the surrounding ecological sites are primarily sandy and loamy ecological sites with substantial sagebrush cover. So there is sagebrush in the area that can be used for escape cover and winter forage if needed. So
It sounds like then that you're making a case for that ecological site that does not have sagebrush proper on it to be considered suitable habitat based on proximity to sagebrush cover and also observed use.
Correct.
Is what I'm hearing. Okay. Okay, then moving on to landscape support, which discusses a potential credit adjustment. Just reading through the bank documents, you can see what I've bulleted out there of the bank, by and large containing all 4 seasons of habitat somewhere on the bank. So I don't know that there's a question there. The question to the CMOG as a matter for discussion would be to consider whether or not the 10 to 15% credit increase that was applied to all the phases, 15 to some, 10 to others, is warranted based on the landscape support information and those threats being ameliorated across the bank. So that would be an item for potentially for this group to discuss. And then other considerations that we pointed out in our September 13th comment letter is for the CMOG also to evaluate the geographic service area. The bank documents indicate that it covers quite a large area that extends beyond Wyoming. And at least for the department, we would note that our jurisdiction is limited to the state.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Butt.
Madam Chair, if I could, I want to clarify that because I looked at the map. I think what they were doing, if I understood it correctly, was showing the 2 management zones from WAFWA, but the line around the state is your geographic area, correct? Nothing outside the state.
That is correct.
Okay.
We've identified that management zone 2 and 4 and 1 portions that are within the boundary of the state of Wyoming are what we're being proposed.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to clarify that because it was a little confusing if you looked at the narrative, but if you looked at the map, it just showed the state, which would be consistent with what I think Amanda is asking.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Loesch.
Madam Chair, thank you. And Mr. Budd, thank you for that clarification. My mistaken interpretation of that piece of the document. Okay, then the transmission line corridor. I think this is a topic for the group to discuss. The bank, 3 phases of the bank are affected by a 2-mile wide state of Wyoming designated transmission line corridor. Phase 1, 2, and 4 by my estimation in looking at some maps. As we previously discussed, this corridor has 3 existing lines in it in some places and 1 existing line in others. And I guess what I would call a reasonably foreseeable transmission line to be constructed in the corridor at some point in the near future. We have had discussions about this transmission line corridor over the course of several years in suggesting that it be dealt with. I think the primary recommendation that has come from the department in the past has been to remove the 2-mile corridor in its entirety from credit availability, given its liability for the existing lines and also the construction of new lines in the future. In the most recent documents that we reviewed for the bank, the Exhibit E discusses the removal of the 250-foot rights-of-ways associated with existing lines from credit consideration, and then also the application of a 600-meter, what I'll call an impact zone, where the credits within those 600 meters from the transmission lines are discounted by 30%. And I think that is tied to a 2015 white paper that was put out on transmission lines specific to the Gateway West project, if I'm not mistaken. And so our comments in this portion of the letter are really getting at the question of whether or not we are dealing with the existing transmission lines, the potential for a future line, and the corridor in general in an appropriate manner for this bank.
Madam Chair, Ms. Loesch, if I could address that. You are correct. The approach that was used is the same approach that is being used on the large high voltage transmission lines that are being permitted and constructed in Wyoming and other states. It was developed in coordination with BLM. Ms. McFerrin was actually a part of that group developing the methodologies that would be used to evaluate both the direct and indirect impacts of transmission on habitat suitability. And it is being applied for all 3 of the major transmission lines that are being proposed or constructed in Wyoming currently. Game and Fish was a substantial part of that review and development process. Matt Fry was on that committee that helped develop those procedures as well. So we did apply, we felt it was an appropriate method to apply, given that that is the expectation of the transmission lines to offset their impacts using those same methods. We basically just flipped the math and reduced the number of credits that would be available by the same amount of impact. So 30% within the 600 meters. And then one thing that we did that the transmission line approach that's being used currently does not do is we removed the entire 250-foot wide right-of-way for all 3 existing lines, as well as the proposed line, just because we won't have full control of management of those right-of-ways. So we removed those entirely from bank credit calculations.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I am not necessarily disagreeing with the methodology in reviewing that white paper that was put out in 2015. It seems to me, at least in my interpretation, that there's more to it than just a 600-meter impact zone. It seems like there's a tiered approach to the impact zone based on the type of impact we're looking at. And then also the potential for variable discounting of credits in those zones accordingly. So I think that is something for discussion, as the 600 meters does address the existing lines. I do not believe it addresses the future line, unless you're telling me that you have accounted for a 600-meter buffer associated with a 250-foot right-of-way that doesn't exist yet within the corridor?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah, we did account for that.
okay. So then it deals with the three existing potential non-existing line at this point, but doesn't account for the footprint of the corridor itself, which could accommodate future lines potentially. And then also, I guess I'm not entirely clear that it wholly comports with the methodology described in that 2015 Gateway West paper. Additionally, there is some more recent science that has come out in 2018 and 2019 specifically regarding grouse and transmission lines that does provide some additional information on how far that impact zone extends from certain types of lines that could be considered. So I think a topic for further discussion as to how those credits within the corridor are being handled.
Madam Chair, if I could address one element of that. You are correct. We didn't apply the full methodology used for the Gateway West project. There is a portion of that impact assessment process that extends the impacts from 600 meters out to 10 kilometers. It's an indirect impact to account for potential predation by corvids. The reason we didn't apply that is that discount or that impact is between 0 and 3% out to 10 kilometers. And we didn't feel like a reduction in functionality of just 1% or 2%, 1.5% on average across that 10-kilometer buffer makes those acres unsuitable for mitigation credit. We felt that small discount was not warranted. Those habitats still are high quality, still provide a lot of value to the bird, and still have, from our perspective, full credit value. So we did not apply that full 10-kilometer buffer. You are correct.
Okay. Second to last topic, overall, just dealing with the credit calculation. In the bank proposal, it was presented that there would be 16,931 credits available for sale in the proposed bank. And that included the acres of suitable habitat after the adjustment that was just described for transmission line rights of way, and that 10 to 15% credit increase for landscape support. And then I bulleted out a couple items that it questionably may not account for, that we should just take a closer look at. I think you've spoken to the cheatgrass piece pretty well, and it sounds like there's some additional supporting information there. I do think we need to consider the removal of all those disturbance acres that are identified in the statewide layer for the modified DDCT, and more consideration for the transmission line corridor and future construction. And then also that the previous question about the disturbance exceeding the 5% and whether or not a discount factor would be applied to that. So nothing new there relative to what we've already talked about. Then finally, under management actions, it was basically just a note about the mix of management actions that are being proposed for the bank, with I think grazing related actions being the most common ones. And then just a question of whether or not appropriate coordination with the BLM has occurred, given that some of the value of the bank is being closely tied to the federal grazing leases that are adjacent to the bank and controlled by the bank owner.
Madam Chair, Ms. Lash. So our current ranch manager on the property does work closely with the BLM. I'll confirm the extent of their relationship and coordinating AUMs and rest rotation to make sure. But I think that's it's one of the bigger priorities for the ranch as it operates the cattle, is to take the objectives and purposes of the habitat and not focus on the grazing component as a separate objective to maximize the grazing on that ranch, but rather use it and incorporate it to meet the objectives for the appropriate suitability in the state in transition through frequent monitoring programs. And so I think we have that as a valuable component to the management, and we'll continue to work closely with the local VLM district offices.
Madam Chairwoman, I think I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Loesch. Let's move over to Department of Ag. Director Miyamoto, Mr. Wickman.
Yeah, Madam Chair, just a clarification when you do talk about your adjacent lands, the management, so BLM, state lands you bring in there. How is that incorporated into the credit side of it, or how that works for you guys?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Mr. Wickman, when we evaluated the credits based on recommendations we received from the state, primarily from Ms. Loesch's predecessors, it was our understanding that by applying similar management actions to the lands that the ranch manager has control over from a grazing perspective. So the adjacent BLM leases, the adjacent state grazing leases, that an additional multiplier was warranted and has been contemplated by this group, I believe. Our understanding was if we had full control over those for that property, that up to a 15% add-on could be available for those properties where we did not have full control. So in the case of phase 4, there are private lands to the north that we don't have grazing rights on. We don't have any influence over how they manage those properties. We reduced that to reflect that northern side is not under control, and just added the 10% add-on. So it's based on control of how we would apply the grazing management process and the other types of activities to benefit sage grouse and those adjacent lands.
And Madam Chair, so your current BLM permits you have are already rest rotation, or are you seeking to change your permits to the rest rotation that you're proposed in the management plan?
Madam Chair, Mr. Wickman, the permits themselves, I don't know, will need to be adjusted. More the implementation of them. I think we're open to discussion on how that is handled. The idea is that we would still maintain the allotments, but put in place an active rest rotation program to follow the results and inform management that we get from the ongoing monitoring. Areas that need to be rested according to the data will be matched.
Madam Chair, I think it's if it's not incorporated currently in their grazing permits, I think you do have to, that's the desire. It's a good, program to do the rest rotation. But based on if you have an allotment management plans or whatever else could change, and people do have public input into permits and processes and those type of things. So, the desire to have those, I think it's important that has to be formalized in your permit. If it's not, so then there's annual operating plans to move forward with it.
Anything further? Okay. Mr. Butt.
Madam Chair, one question, and then a suggested path of where we go. Just describe the assurances that you have put in place. I think in the last week, you have modified those, if I could, just to basically mirror what was required by the federal government of the existing bank, and that your assurances will do the same thing, if I understand it correctly. You want to give us a quick rundown of how those will be handled?
Absolutely, Madam Chair, Mr. Budd. So we've tried to be as consistent with federal guidelines throughout this process, and we feel that the steps we've taken throughout this to develop what those assurances would look like, both on a financial front and on controlling language on the operations of those finances, meets and exceeds in many areas. We have our primary tool for the long-term stewardship of the bank, and note that these credits in this proposed bank is a bank in perpetuity. And so we have outlined a very robust management spreadsheet, which is found in the endowment exhibits. I believe it is, pull it up here, and I can screen share anything that we need to follow along with, but we have the primary tool as the endowment account found in Exhibit E. I apologize. Sorry, Exhibit C2 is the endowment fund analysis and schedule. So in that spreadsheet, we list out a very robust plan to actively monitor and collect data each year with burden labor cost factored into that. So what we've developed in this program is essentially a $4 million management fund that will be built out through the sale of credits. That fund will be a non-wasting account, and we have the language set forth and how that will operate, and who the endowment holder and how that will function. But that's our primary tool, and we've got a secondary tool. Charles, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like, Charles has been instrumental in helping develop this for us.
Madam Chair and Mr. Budd, I think kind of in some of what Nathan was discussing before, and in talking assurances, maybe even one step back, if you would, the primary, conservation tool here is going to be operating through a restrictive covenant, effectively a deed restriction in which the landowner places in perpetuity the land under certain restrictions so that they can carry on an ag operation in its current form, but not allow any of the development or the things that would otherwise harm the species and the habitat. So that's the primary tool that would be monitored, made effective so that it's in public record with the state of Wyoming with the ability to enforce that. Beyond that, though, as Nathan mentioned, they've developed this very comprehensive calculus of what it takes to manage and operate that ranch within the confines of what that restrictive covenant would require and our objectives of the bank in perpetuity. That becomes funded through credit sales over time. As we sell these, we fund this account up to an approximate $4 million fund, where the income generated off that is what provides for ranch management. One additional feature to that fund, however, that's worth pointing out is that obviously in the beginning, as credit sales begin to occur and may not have as much, there's an initial kind of a front-loaded assurance where we could provide a letter of credit or something to a portion of that fund totaling approximately $500,000 is what the calculus comes out right at the beginning of credit sales, so that there's assurance that even if we don't sell the number of credits anticipated, that there's still some protection to make sure that the ranch is monitored. That's the primary fund. The second tool that Nathan mentioned is for catastrophic loss. And so in the event that there's some event that occurs to some of this protected habitat that is just so beyond our control and is, through normal management plan operations, unable to be rehabilitated in that sense. So what we've agreed to do is set aside another $1 million fund, which is there and available for the state to access in the event that we have any destruction of covered habitat that cannot be reasonably accomplished through the primary fund. So that account would be set aside at a financial institution for the state after coordination with the bank sponsor and a determination of the impact to access to replace that acreage. Madam Chairman, thank you. I think that the one thing that you left out, the expectation we would have is that those funds sit there basically are escrowed because you will do the maintenance, the monitoring, the management out of your own funds instead of out of that fund as you get started. When the fund becomes fully vested and is completed, then you could draw the money out of that to do it, or you could use your own. It's an insurance policy. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And the other $1 million fund would be accessible by the state in the case that you did not address the catastrophic event, say a fire, flood, whatever else. You would still have the right and the responsibility to deal with that. If you chose not to, then OSLI could access that $1 million to do it themselves or to have it done. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, that's good. The other point, Madam Chairman, I would make, and I want to hear particularly from our federal partners on this before we get very far, but in reading through all of the information and discussing this with many members of the CMOG and the proponent, it appears to me that there are really a couple of things that we need to do. One, and the first is to say, do they meet the qualifications for a bank, which I believe they've shown that they do. The biological, Amanda, thanks to you, I think you've done a thorough job of looking at that. It's there. There are some questions, and I'll get to that in a minute. But have they met the biological threshold? And I think the answer to that is yes. Have they met the threshold for assurances? And I think the answer to that is yes. Have they got a plan to deal with it relative to long-term easements and a partner who will hold those easements? I believe the answer to that is yes. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with only a couple of things that I think are unresolved, but I don't know that they need to be resolved today. And that is, I still have questions about the corridor and whether or not it's been adequately discounted for the loss of habitat or the loss of functional habitat. That doesn't mean it's unsuitable. It just means we may disagree on how many credits should be allocated to that particular 2-mile corridor. Likewise, the issues that Amanda has raised with habitat suitability and other. By looking at those and saying, that's something we could address down the road, I think it would give the proponent the opportunity to go out and do more observational work, collar birds should they choose, document that there's bird use in those areas, in which case there wouldn't be any discount at all applied. Those things have not been done in the level of detail that the science allows us to say, no, the science is wrong here, that we've shown that we have a greater amount of use or it's more highly functional. Again, I don't think that has to be done today. But the question to me is, does this meet the standards? And from what I've seen, and certainly I've encouraged the proponent through time, is to be consistent with what the federal government has allowed at Pathfinder. And so Heather, I need you to weigh in on that. And likewise, I think we want to be sure that we're consistent with what is being required on transmission lines. If you're going to say to the company, this is what you have to mitigate, it's pretty hard to tell the habitat provider that they have to do more than that. So I need some clarification there. But Madam Chairman, that would be my suggestion, that I think we've established that they have met the basic criteria to be certified as a bank. The question remains how many credits they get at this point in time. So I would throw that out to the group. But Heather and Jenny and Brian, I very much appreciate your thoughts as well.
Thank you, Mr. Budd. Why don't we go ahead and go to the federal partners then? I think they're on the Zoom. Who wants to start? Looks like Heather.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, I would agree. I appreciate your comments, Bob. And Amanda, we appreciate the comments of the department as well. Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm a little behind. I just received the documents yesterday, so I have not been able to dive into them into great detail. And I'm afraid my question might take us back significantly, because my questions, like Bob's saying, really revolve around the credit evaluation and the specificity there. I'm having a hard time tracking through the documents where we have additions, where we have subtractions. And then we have lingering concerns about the transmission line corridor. Many of those would be echoed by what the department said earlier in their previous statements. So, overall, I would agree with Bob. I think some of the assurances have been met, but I would appreciate some additional time in reviewing those in relation to some of our existing policies and then some of our pre-listing conservation policies, just to make sure I don't get out of line of what any sort of federal requirement might be coming from Fish and Wildlife Service mitigation standards. So I hesitate to ask some of my questions because I'm afraid they're rather detailed, but I'll put it out there for the record at least, and you guys can choose whether or not you address it at this time. But I would appreciate a real thorough walkthrough of the credit evaluations and with a particular focus on the transmission line corridors. Particularly Mr. Kmeyer, I'm having a hard time following the 30% reduction and how that relates to what we've worked on past transmission lines. And we would echo the department's concerns about the entire corridor and the future build out of that and the future sustainability and function of the habitat within there. So with that, I will leave that up to the group. If there's time and possibility of walking through that in greater detail, happy to hear it now, or I can talk to folks offline. I also don't want to hog all of the time because I know BLM probably has some questions as well. So I will leave it with that to the group.
CMOG, any interest in walking through it step by step, or should we move along?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Booth.
I don't think we have time today to walk through it line by line, step by step. I think what our role is to identify this as a potential problem. That doesn't mean that they can't be, there's a number associated with this. And just as an example, Amanda and I talked about this in what they have identified as phase 3 of the 3 phases that they would like to sell. There is no conflict with the transmission line. There is no debate or dispute over the number of credits that they have said they believe that they have. So theoretically, they could sell credits in that portion and resolve these other issues in a month or 6 months or whatever. They just can't sell any of those credits. Likewise, in what they have identified as phase 4, there have been some things identified, particularly with invasive annual grasses. But again, you have very minimal transmission line issues in that section. In the one that's identified as phase 1, it's right through the middle of it. That is a major concern. I think that's what Heather is saying, and that's what I'm saying. And in phase 2, you have a lesser degree, but you also have to remember in phase 1, there's only one line presently. There's only one going through there. It isn't all 3, but you expect that there will be another. Those are unknowns that I think we can't just wave our hands and say, oh yeah, you're good to go, because we don't know. I think that requires more detailed discussion, but I don't think it should hold up the certification of the bank, because there's a significant portion of these credits are in an area that doesn't have any conflict. Does that make sense?
Anybody want to respond to Mr. Budd's comment? Okay. Anything further, Heather, or should we move along to Jennifer?
Yeah, no, I think we can move along. Thanks, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The BLM, not to beat a dead horse, supports the line of comments and concerns as they pertain to the transmission line. So we are also interested in further discussion. The BLM also shares the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and Wyoming Department of Agriculture's concerns and interest in formalizing future management in the BLM permits and allotment management plans. Additionally, BLM feels there should be further coordination at the field office level with the fire, weed, and recreation programs, just because they were mentioned in the plan, and there should be just further coordination with BLM on those items. And then one additional question that we have is the BLM would like to inquire whether the bank has any interest in pursuing any avenues to incorporate any BLM lands or to further secure any mineral development limitations for the bank.
MC Ridge folks, any?
Madam Chair
response?
and Ms. Marsloff. We will definitely work with the local fire management and response teams to coordinate efforts and training protocol. That's one of the items that has been identified. That's something that we plan to continue to develop. I think one of the big, an overall in sort of a global approach to this project is the understanding that this is a long-term commitment on behalf of the bank sponsor and all the staff that work on site to work together with those local response teams, work together with the district offices and develop those plans using the objectives of the bank and the habitat quality as the metrics that is followed. So we take that with appreciation that those will continue to be built and strengthened with the local response from fire, weed, and other local level involvement. The question, if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Marsloff, so was the question regarding the expansion of the bank into BLM credits, or was it for development? I apologize.
That is correct. The BLM does have avenues to incorporate BLM lands into the bank. And it's just a matter of submitting the request and letting us process it. I don't want to say just a matter. It's complex, but the option is there.
Madam Chair, Ms. Marlowe, understood. Okay, thank you. And at this point, we have not pursued that. And I think we would be open to conversations with the BLM and looking for long-term solutions. So that is definitely something to take under consideration. Thank you for that input.
All right, anything else, Jennifer?
No, thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thanks. I think, Brian, do you have anything? Is Brian still on the line? Well, we're not getting a response from Brian. Okay, I think we've been through all the federal partners on the line. Jason, was there anything else on behalf of OSLI that you wanted to raise?
Madam Chairwoman, can you hear me now?
There you are, Brian. Great.
I'm sorry if I'm having heck with my phone. Madam Chairwoman, I think most of my comments have been raised. Just add on a couple. I think Mr. Wickman brought up most of my concerns. I guess I would have, and I agree totally with what Mr. Budd said. I think they've demonstrated, their certification ability. Just some things I think that could be worked on or improved would be that management plan end of things. I think given the level of inventory they have, I'd like to see some stuff on actual forage inventory and some general breakdown of how their proposed management going forward would look. And then, also tying in with that federal state land part, how those agreements with federal state land agencies exist now or look to exist in the future. Similarly, I think on the adaptive management part, I would like to see some more detail there on, they basically list off a few references that could be used to develop adaptive management metrics and triggers, but they don't really define which ones they plan to use. Then finally, I would just echo, I didn't have a lot of time to review the documents, and so, greater understanding and ability to walk through some of the calculations would be helpful for me as well. I had issues with the transmission line as well. And finally, just because I'm with NRCS, I think there's a better way to display some of the state and transition stuff than is provided in the document. I found that rather confusing, honestly, but I think that's it for me.
Any response from Dempsey?
Madam Chair, Mr. Jensen, thank you for the input. So I guess as a question to NRCS and generally to the CMOG board, one of the things we've tried to do is present or package up the data, the information, the plans and the methods how to go about long-term stewardship and how to keep it open enough that we don't have commitments today to a practice that may evolve into a commitment that's no longer effective. I think if we're able, or we have the option to interact at the local level and individually, such as having our team work direct with Brian in some aspects to make sure that the plans do develop and proceed consistently. If that is an option, that may be an effective way. I guess my question is to this point, we've tried our best to package and prepare from a blank canvas and present that. And if there is and where there's room to develop and improve and coordinate, if we're comfortable with the idea of generally how we move forward, what would be the best way to execute that? Is that on the direct level with, for example, in our CS and with the local districts to make sure and have them report back to CMOG or signatory agencies to confirm that the direction that the bank and the bank sponsor is going in any of these avenues is consistent with what's set out in our proposal?
Mr. Budd.
Madam Chair, I have a concern that we're starting to get into the details of how individuals run their own branches or their own banks. I think this group has raised a number of issues for you that are concerns. But if you look at the statute and the rules, there's an obligation for you to report annually. I would say that you've got a whole list of things you need to report on in the first year, including whether or not you are eligible for more credits because you've documented bird use or you've documented other things. And so there are things that I think, and I don't disagree with any of the points that have been raised by Chris, Brian, Jenny, or Heather, or Amanda. I think those are all good points. I keep coming back to, are any of those a fatal flaw that says that you shouldn't be certified? No, I don't believe there are. Do I believe you should have 16,971 credits? No, I have no idea if that's the right number. But I think that the bank certainly could begin operating, and you've got a lot of questions to answer in order to liberate the total number of credits you think are out there. That's where I come down. And I really am reluctant to tell you that you have to write a certain kind of management plan. You're absolutely correct with the adaptive management piece that you have to be able to change. And just as an example, if we'd have certified it 2 years ago, you'd still be spraying Plateau. Rejuvra has been approved for cheatgrass. It's much more effective. Those changes are going to happen, and you need to have an opening for those things to be dealt with as they come along. So I don't want us to get down in the weeds and analyze and parse every sentence here. The question to me and that we're asked is, do they meet the requirements?
Any other comments from the CMOG?
Madam Chair, Madam Chair, thank you. Mr. Budd, just one point of clarification, not having been involved with a bank certification in the past, it would seem to me that if the decision is to allow the bank to move forward and to become certified, I feel like it would be a big question mark as part of the proposal, especially as it goes to the state land board for approval of how many credits there are being certified. Do you feel like certifying the bank is a separate process than determining the number of credits? Or are you suggesting that there's a preliminary number of credits to approve based on the fact that they may not be impacted by some of these outstanding issues, and that they move forward with like an interim number and then come back at a later date with more discussion about the certification of the remaining credits in the phases that are affected by the transmission corridor, for instance?
Madam Chair, Ms. Losh, the latter is exactly what I would think would make sense. And Heather, you're going to have to help me here, but I don't know how many recertifications and amendments have been done on Pathfinder, which is the only one of these in the world. So I think we ought to use it as a model. It's also been approved by Fish and Wildlife at the time that the species was a candidate, which is very important as well to the state. But they have come back and modified the number of credits they have. They've added credits through purchase of other properties. And I think that that's an ongoing conversation that could happen. But I don't think you approve 16,900 credits if there's question about some of them. There are a certain number of them that I don't think are in dispute. And I used phase 3 as an example of that. I don't think there's any dispute over those numbers. So there's that many credits right there. Heather helped me out, but I think you guys each year, as you look at Pathfinder, you review the number of credits. They come in and ask to have them changed. They've done that at least once that I know of, and then they've amended with purchase of other properties. Am I correct?
Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Budd, they have amended their bank, to my knowledge, one time when there were some additional properties added. We don't evaluate annually. That number has not changed other than the one time the amendment was done.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Wickman.
Clarification then on the phases, and intuitively to me, phase 1, we're going to go first. How does that build up work? Because if Bob, mentioned, phase 1 has some concerns with that transmission line going through it now. Is it as credits are done, filled for phase 1, then you move into phase 2? And can you explain how the phases work?
Madam Chair, Mr. Wickman, yes, absolutely. That's the intent, is to come to the CMOG and to the signatory agencies with a total project scope, all of the lands that would ultimately be incorporated, have the data readily available, the plans in place, and the overall language and controlling language on the bank in its entirety. Then to implement the bank throughout those phases, either all at once, and I think that's more of a market-driven decision, either multiple phases at one time, or to go through the process of implementing a phase and successfully closing out a phase and starting another phase.
And Madam Chair, I think that distinction, I guess, is important because, on phase 1, it looks like there's 2,600 credits available instead of like the 16,000. I know it's market driven, but I think that's maybe what some of the questions relying on how do we walk through all of those, the question marks that are tied to the 10% increase and those type of things. But I'm with you, Bob, on certification of the bank. It's probably not a question. I think it really comes down to what are we certifying as far as number of credits at the get-go, and what would be the process in the future if changes happen. Of course, the fire reclamation come back, a well pad that comes back, those type of things are valid things that could increase it, but things could go the other way too. So.
Madam Chair, Mr. Wickman, and CMOG in general, I agree. I think that's valid points. One proposal, I suppose, or one maybe response to how to best go about this, if we're having open discussion, I guess this would be an idea to, if we were to look at a couple of the key components that are still needing to be further evaluated. We've got the degree and level of indirect impacts, I think within the existing lines that there, and I think the foreseeable one that's very likely. If we were to propose, we have our total credit valuation, we have our methodology, we have already taken into account what we felt was an adequate methodology for that. But to look at an increased discount for those areas within that potential indirect path and assign a certain value to what that discount would be today, with the opportunity to come back and demonstrate use and functionality of that habitat sufficient to meet the standards of suitability with the other areas of the ranch, to then go back to ultimately recover back to where we initially have proposed that credit valuation to be. And then another suggestion would perhaps looking at the landscape, the incremental increase where we've got an additional number of credits added for landscape support. If we go through, I think those will be conversations and also demonstrations to introduce those when those have been met. And if we were to do that, we have about 3,400 acres, is 3,376. We have about 3,400 acres that are included in that calculation. If we took the incremental increase and we assigned on top of the existing reductions of what we've done for the area within the transmission line buffer, and we added another 25% discount to that, it gives us about 3,400 credits cumulatively that may be warranted, but at this time maybe cannot be confirmed, I guess. Is that a better way to say it? To have the opportunity to reduce those from the ledger at the get-go. And with the idea that if we can come back and successfully demonstrate functionality and everything that's needed to meet those standards, have those released at a later time, whether that's 6 months or a year, 18 months, I don't know. Is that a adequate compromise or proposal?
Mr. Butt.
Madam Chair, Nathan, I think that's just throwing stuff at the wall to see what will stick. I would probably be much more comfortable going back to the original recommendation from the department that you take out all the lands that are within the 2-mile corridor at this point in time. Then there's no debate. Then you've got a very credible number that you can say, okay, those are not eligible until such time as we can document that they're usable, that they're suitable, and that the birds are in the habitat. That does what you're saying, but it gives us a basis for it that is not just, well, we think 30 is right, but we'll add 25 more. I don't think we can, with a straight face, that we can go in and say, yeah, we use the best science available to come up with that. If we do take the 2 miles, we can say we took that area and gave no allocation for those credits at this point in time. That gives you time to answer the questions that Heather and Amanda and others have had and come back and then reclaim those. So in essence, those lands, those credits would be escrowed until you can show that they are eligible to come back. I'd be much more comfortable with that than just throwing percentages and seeing what, that's what we tried to avoid with our mitigation framework.
Madam Chair, thank you. So to take the total number of credits and release X number of them with the condition that with performance or with demonstration, the remainder would be released. I guess the question, and maybe I'll turn the question over to John or Charles, if there's any designation or criteria that we could at least walk away or understand at this point, what level of criteria to meet that second phase, I guess, of release, if there's any questions on how that would operate other than.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, Mr. Budd, everyone generally, I think one of the concerns that we would have walking out today without some clarity on process is that it's been a comprehensive project to date. We've been at this for quite some time. We're here finally seeking approval. It's a first kind of run at this from the CMOG as well. We appreciate that and are very grateful for the efforts that everyone's put in to try and understand this process and put it together as kind of the first instance here. If we were to walk away knowing that we do have bank approval, but only with a very limited number of credits, that 2 mile corridor is quite significant through this project. And if we start from zero, I think we would just maybe need some clarification, some comfort, and some direction walking out of this meeting as to how this process works to make that determination. We could easily envision a process where we debate, negotiate, and 10 years later, we've still never agreed on science. These meetings have been delayed, and we know everyone has busy schedules. If we had some certainty as to when we could have defined timelines to get back together to have presented our evidence, either come together on the number or not, but some clarification on process, that would be helpful.
So Madam Chair, if I may, again, I don't think it's our place to tell you what the process is to do that. My comfort level is in saying you've got a 2 mile swath through there. And if you'll bear with me a minute, and Amanda's been incredibly helpful. She and I spent most of the day on the phone yesterday. You have a scientific paper that says the actual footprint, 250 feet from right of way to right of way, is basically of no value to sage grouse. You remove that. Now, there's science out there that says in the next 600 meters, 600 meters, next 600 meters, the diminution of use is somewhere between 75 and 90%. I don't know whether it's 75 or 90. I don't know if it's even less than that, but that's just what it suggests. The next 600 meters, there's a diminution, I believe, that's 25 to 40%, 25 to 60%, something like that. And then outside that, there's a diminution that goes from somewhere from 0 to 5%. And that's what Mr. Keymeyer said. So there are methodologies out there to look at it a different way. 2 miles is a very, I guess it's punistic in many ways to you, but for the state to just say, we trust you, which we do. And, you know, as an we can't do that. As an example, in that 2 mile corridor, if it goes right through the middle of it, then you've got, you know, you have to evaluate either side. If it goes through the west side or the east side, it changes that calculus. So I think that is open-ended, but again, that was the recommendation of the department early on. It is penal, I guess, to you in many ways, but I'm not hesitant to certify the bank for what is not in that, because those are unknown. And then I think we'll all work with you to figure out what the best way to calculate the number of credits within that 2 miles should be. I certainly will. I know Amanda's done it on a daily basis for months. So that's the best I can tell you. I don't know how you, other than accepting that science today, which would take a complete recalculation. To me, it's fairly simple to say we're going to hold that 2 mile swath in limbo until we know better what the actual effect is, and release the other credits. That would be my sense, Madam Chairman.
Other members of the CMOG, any comment to Mr. Budd's comments?
Madam Chair, thank you, Mr. Budd. I agree. I think while the 2 mile transmission corridor does seem like a large, long and wide area to potentially lose credits in, some of the more recent science that has come out after 2015 does even indicate that the indirect impacts of transmission lines can extend well beyond a 2 mile area from a transmission line. So I think we are in support of at least removing the 2 mile corridor and holding those credits back. And some of those will not be suitable credits, should not be considered suitable credits, period, in the proposal at any time, because they're in a portion of a right of way that cannot be controlled by the bank or the landowner. But I think more time to figure out what the correct discount to those credits are at various distances from the lines, perhaps within that 2 mile corridor, is appropriate. So I would echo what Mr. Budd is saying on that front. That being said, the transmission line corridor is just one of the outstanding issues that affects the overall number of credits. I think the other pieces to be resolved and discussed by the CMOG have to do with the potential 10% discount for the modified DDCT being over the 5% threshold, whether or not the CMOG feels that the 10 to 15% increase that has been asserted by the bank is appropriate based on the landscape support factor. And then also, this is probably more minor in the scheme of things, but as I discussed in the beginning, making sure that all of the disturbance in the statewide disturbance layer that is indeed being counted as disturbance in the modified DDCT is removed from the suitable habitat acres that are being calculated for the credits. So even in phase 3 at this point, I'm not 100% sure that the acres available in phase 3 are accounting for disturbance acres in the statewide layer. And I know, John, you had some additional information related to that in thinking that there was some evidence on the ground that some of those disturbance acres may be able to come off the disturbance raster, which is great. And I think we need to just take our time to do a cross-check comparison on that front. So I think aside from the transmission line corridor, there are a couple other issues that would affect the total calculation of suitable or of available credits for this bank walking out of this room today that would need to be figured out.
Madam Chair, Ms. Losh, Mr. Budd, I appreciate the input there. I think absolutely one of the things you'd mentioned early on is just trying to find consistency across the methodologies. And I think that would be important if we had that in mind as we go through and calculate what the discount and the appropriate scientific defensible discount should be on acreage and habitat and values, to look at look at it in the context of how impacts are weighted, especially when we're considering that the impacts we're discussing impact the exact same habitat that we're talking about preserving. So it should have a very high level of similarity and consistency, I would think. And so comfortable knowing that, or I guess a comfort level of knowing that we're working towards similar application, looking at an impact going in and disturbing habitat being assessed with one valuation of what that impact is should be measured against going in and preserving that habitat with similar methodologies. And you know, I think we've talked about this also, is just understanding that, you know, looking at this from a map and taking a marker and blocking off a 2-mile corridor is easy, but recognizing how much functional habitat exists within that corridor and the likelihood that within another 100 years, you know, each of these lines are co-located so close to one another. What is the likelihood? And we've got provisions in there to address that if in 100 years more lines are going in, and that is something that does get built out, even if it doesn't, that we've built that in there for protection. But I just would like to make sure we're comfortable with understanding that we appreciate the input on landscape support as well as the DDCT. We follow that very closely to make sure. And I think we have some opportunities to go in and demonstrate some reclamation that DDCT may be able to reflect through an updated run. But our biggest focus would be to find a level of consistency on the discounting valuation that matches what impacts are assessed with.
Okay, members of the CMOG, it looks like we are out of time for today. In fact, we're 7 minutes over. But needless to say, what's the pleasure of the group for purposes of today? Is there a recommendation to be made? Do you want a little more time? And I want to be respectful for Dempsey. Mainly, we need to move forward and be proactive. And I realize you guys have waited a long time, and this has all been new to us with new rules, new statutes, new everything. So we're in a little bit of uncharted territory. But with that said, you know, it sounds to me like there may be some more information that the CMOG wants here before moving forward, maybe not. And so if there is more information, I'd like to have some sort of solid timeframes so that we're being fair to the applicant here and they kind of know the plan moving forward.
Madam Chairwoman, this is Mike McCollum. Is it too late to make a quick comment?
No, by all means.
Well, my comment really is kind of an overview. You know, I've been doing banks for 20 years, and one thing that happens when you're going through these types of approval processes is, especially at this juncture, is you can get into the weeds, as Bob Budd has sort of indicated. And when you do that, I mean, there's plenty of weeds to go through on any project. But when you do that, you kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. The bigger picture in my mind is you've got a really excellent piece of property, and a lot of it, it's contiguous, that's going to, over the long term, provide really excellent habitat overall for the target species, grouse, as well as many other species. And so I just would like to, you know, sort of encourage people to take a step back and realize what a gem this whole project is and how it's going to serve everyone's interest. And taking out a 2-mile swath, is a huge financial hit to this bank. And I'm not sure it pencils out. I mean, we'll have to discuss it with the bank sponsor and everything, but those kind of hits. And then, you know, and I think the reason Nathan was asking for a process is that if we agree to take it out now with the idea that maybe we get some of it back later, that's a pretty difficult thing to do without some sort of guidelines. And it's a hard thing to do for a bank sponsor to risk when there's such a huge financial hit on this. And so I'm not saying anything other than, you know, just, you know, try to, in my encouragement and how these things typically flow, is, just sort of look at the bigger picture as well as some of the weeds. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. And one thing that we did not do, which I intended to do, like I said, we're kind of short on time, but are there any members of the public that are on the Zoom that want to make a comment? We have virtually an empty room here. But if there are members of the public that wanted to make a comment, we would certainly receive that at this point. Okay, I don't see any hands raised.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Budd.
I'm going to suggest that, given the time, the delays and everything else, and the amount of work that's gone into this, that we advance this to a board matter at the next board meeting. You can certainly withdraw it if the question's not been resolved. That puts the onus back on the proponent that they need to help resolve some of these questions. If they want to do something different than carve out the 2 miles, if they want to recalculate using the most available science, what that deduction would be, if they want to address Ms. Losh's concern about the whether or not it is a 10% reduction on the disturbance layer. Those are things that I think can be addressed. And if it isn't addressed by the October meeting, it would bump it to December. Is that? I think we need to put it on the board agenda in the case that we could get it there, rather than automatically defer it to December, I guess is what I'm suggesting, Madam Chair. Understanding your processes and all the way that we have to go through that. So that would be my suggestion. Or motion, however you want it.
Thank you, Mr. Budd. Any thoughts on that from Game and Fish or Department of Ag? Mr. Wickman.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good path forward to move on. If we can leave it up to the proponent to try to address some of these questions going to the board, I think is probably fair.
Ms. Loesch, you look like you had a comment as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, I guess my question would be, when is the next State Land Board meeting scheduled for?
October, what's the first Thursday? 7th, October 7th.
Okay. It's a pretty short amount of time to work on some of these issues, but we're certainly happy to give it our full attention in the next few weeks to see what we can bring to resolution in advance of that board meeting.
Mr. Crowder, Deputy Director Crowder. We have not made much in the way of comments on behalf of OSLI. I just wanted to make sure that anything addressed by the group here, that there wasn't something additional from OSLI.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know that there's anything additional. Our first day. A lot of lessons that we learned moving forward. What I'm recognizing are some holes that our rules as far as that seems like there are some questions that we had internally as far as financial assurances. Those were adequate based on the CBOMs. If they met the muster of additional outcomes. I don't know. Heard that again. We're trying to find that out from others or of a muster. One of the other things that I'd like to do, make sure that we have in place, maintain the integrity of this process. Sure that we get the position of that is what be able to move forward from that. Is that process that Fish and the Fish folks coordinate individually, that Fish comes back to us and says, yes, that's fine. How would you like to move forward in December, or would you like us to be that clearinghouse to make sure that all of that will that talk in a moment.
Thank you, Deputy.
Madam Chair. I
Mr.
guess
Budd.
Before I suggested that, we should ask Dempsey Ridge if they think they can meet that timeline, or if they prefer to wait until we go to the December board. That probably my mistake, but I would like to know what they think. That is a very short time.
That's a very good point, Director Budd. Our board matters have to be to the board a week before that meeting. And so usually we're feverishly trying to get the board matters done and ready to go as quickly as possible. So really, it's going to depend on the applicant as to whether they think they can meet that, or if they would rather we continue the discussion into December.
Madam Chair and Mr. Budd, I think the proposal is a good plan, that if we can put this forward with the idea that we have a short period of time to cover a fair amount of ground. And I think Game and Fish holds a lot of the points that have been brought up. If Game and Fish is comfortable and we can get some input from the federal agencies as well, but as long as we're able to work direct with Game and Fish, I think that is a faster approach. If State Lands is comfortable with that, to be able to coordinate efforts in a short period of time, I think that's probably the most effective, with the idea that if perhaps 2 weeks comes and we still have some more room more ground to cover, that we would defer to the next board meeting. I like that approach better. Obviously, there's a lot to do in a short period of time, but it sets the bar for what we need to demonstrate.
Thank you. So we do have a motion on the table from Director Budd. Do we have a second to that motion? And I understand the motion to be essentially, let's go ahead and get this on the path toward being a board matter at the Board of Land Commissioners meeting for October the 7th, using all available resources and time to work in that direction. And in the event that's not possible, we'll regroup at that point and hopefully could get it on the December agenda. Did I accurately state your? Okay, all right. Do I hear a second to that motion?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Madam Chair, I know it's the focus on the credit portion of this is Game and Fish, but I think there are other questions on the permitting that I think BLM, Jenny mentioned too, that we'd like to sit down and try to get, because that's getting into your plus 10 to 15. So we can work with you also during this timeline.
And my comment would just be, I agree with you that it would be, I think, more efficient for you all to work directly with Game and Fish and Department of Ag. And if these agencies will just keep OSLI in the loop and let us know where you are in the process so that we know whether to move forward with the board matter or not, that would be helpful. And we'll just have to keep the dialogue open, have to commit to one another to do that so that we know where things stand. All right, any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye. Aye. That would be an aye as well. So, okay, well, that's the immediate path forward, and glad we're making some progress. So thank you all very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, members of the CMOG. Appreciate all your hard work, and we'll continue to be in touch in the next few weeks. So thank you.